Paper 3, Issues and Debates, Ethical Implications of Research Studies and Theory. Within this last section of Issues and Debates, we talk around ethics. Now, our understanding of ethics are ethical guidelines. So these are consent, debrief, protection from harm, right to withdraw, established to protect those involved in the research, so the participants. This last section talks about three different types of ethics. Ethical guidelines that we know, ethical issues, and ethical implications. So if we start with ethical issues, these arise when there is a conflict. So we want to gain some valuable research, but we need to make sure that we are protecting the rights and dignity of our participants. And these ethical issues can spiral into research that is socially sensitive. Something that is socially sensitive is anything that's controversial. So doing research into sexuality, race, even parenting can provide issues from that study. What we need to think about then are a different third type of ethics, which is our implication. So the impact of doing this study on society. How is that study going to impact or influence public policy, what the governments are going to do with it, or how certain groups are seen, i.e. women, especially if we talk about parenting. So this whole section isn't just talking about consent, debrief, blah, blah, blah. It's also thinking about what issues are going to arise and what is going to be the impact. Now, something that is socially sensitive, like I said, it's controversial. We also need to think, well, what's going to happen once that study is published? So it could be seen as giving scientific credibility to potential prejudice and discrimination. So once that's been published and it's out there in the ether for everybody to see, what will that do for certain groups, especially if particular groups decide all this research is really important, we should publish it? How is that going to affect the groups that it's sort of been researched on? Now, let's just break down those three types of ethics just to really get in our heads that within this section we don't just talk about consent, debrief, etc. Ethical guidelines set for research permission are seen by some as too strict. So we're talking here about the guidelines that we know from the back of Milgram's research and Zimbardo's research. We had to have right to withdraw, protection from harm, etc. Now, there are areas of research which maybe not having such strict guidelines that researchers have to adhere to could mean that we get some really impactful research that we may not necessarily get if we stick to the guidelines. So this is our AO3 here. Sometimes it's not possible to see what the effects of research might be on the researcher, the participants, and society. Sometimes researchers do things that they're just interested in, and they don't realise what could come of, from those findings. So it does make it really hard to judge, and it's not an objective decision. So there's going to be bias within the decision makers as to whether or not it's going to cause problems over time. For example, any research into homosexuality is seen as a socially sensitive topic because people, policymakers and just general society, depending on what those findings are, it can make some groups vulnerable. Now, we have these guidelines, they have been put in place to protect people. They've become more careful as time's gone on because, we think of our shocking research, the impact that has on the people involved and the researcher. We've got to protect all parties. Okay, so some are saying it's too strict and it's not allowing for us to get the best we could do from psychological research. Others say that it's really hard to judge what the impact's going to be. And others are saying, well, actually, no, we need to be strict because then we are reducing problems in the future. Benefits for groups, a strength of socially sensitive research. So if we're doing something that is controversial, it actually can have benefits for the group being studied. Now, really interesting study here, talking about homosexuality. 1950s in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, or DSM, this was seen as a sociopathic personality disorder. Removed in 73, and this change was on the back of the Kinsey reports, which was based on lots of interviews. They were anonymous, 5,000 men about their sexual behaviour, included 6,000 women. So we had a real vast sample of men and women talking about sexuality, and it caused so much outrage for the time because it was taboo. You know, homosexuality was seen as not only a criminal offence but also a personality disorder, and that no one discussed. So this report kind of blew that wide open and changed how people viewed homosexuality. In some studies, there could be negative consequences, you know, if we're talking about a criminal gene, for example, or a homosexuality gene. People who are gay and don't have that gene, that's going to have an impact on their identity, questioning, you know, who they are. And similarly, the criminal gene, if you have that gene, are you then predisposed to be a criminal? As we know from diathesis stress, not necessarily. So it does suggest that when we are researching these topics, we've got to be really careful about the outcome and the impact and the consequence of this research. For some, it may be beneficial. For others, it may be more challenging. Poor research design. A limitation that we see with a lot of socially sensitive research is that the way it's set up could lead to findings that are inaccurate. So, for example, the 11 plus, which some private schools and independent schools still use today, is based on faulty evidence, faulty research. The guy that did it basically fudged a lot of the numbers. He said that intelligence was heritable, like you are, there is obviously a biological element to intelligence, but he was saying by the age of 11, you can distinguish who is naturally intelligent and who isn't. Through this exam, this 11 plus, it's a load of rubbish. Therefore, any research on socially sensitive areas, intelligence is socially sensitive, IQ is quite socially sensitive, is going to have enduring effects on particular groups. The fact it's still used today baffles me, because it's such an out-of-date, inaccurate piece of evidence that, you know, people who have failed the 11 plus think that they're stupid, but actually they're using a study or using a method that is implorable, which doesn't work. So what I've got for the rest then in your booklets is some research. What makes it important? Again, this is important for those questions that say refer to areas in psychology. So thinking about things like Bowlby's maternal deprivation, how is that socially sensitive? Why is it potentially important that we do that study or not? Okay, and if you pause it, I've then got the answers on the other side. To finish, as always, just some research methods, a 4, 6 and 5 marker, talking about this area of social sensitivity, gender dysphoria or atypical gender disorder, identity disorder. So pause this and have a go.